And as Pastor Waller mentioned, I am an associate professor of urban education at Temple University. And urban education is partly biological, partly autobiographical, and partly intellectual for me. I grew up in New York City, public schools, K-12, and I was sort of lucky enough to have what Matthew will call dialogic teachers who sort of changed my path and allowed me to accomplish things in life that many of my classmates didn't have. I read this book with great interest. As researchers, we tend to be cautious. We tend to study the problems of urban classrooms like Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, places like that. But we hesitate to sort of give practical advice to teachers about what to do. And you don't hesitate to do that. And so I admire you for that. And I also admire you because you are a quintessential practitioner, but you're also quite theoretical as well. You have real opinions about how kids learn and the importance of not only curriculum, but building relationships and doing identity work, which some teachers don't see as their job, but it in fact is. So I found your book to be humorous, insightful, and then very pragmatic. And I have way too many questions that I can possibly ask you, but I want to start with the obvious one, which is, what was the impetus for a teacher to go ahead and write a book like this?
Well, and thank you. I am overwhelmed this evening. So much. Thank you so much. I was very blessed, to be honest. I did a session with a colleague of mine at our school's conference on how to have race conversations in the classroom, and it went pretty well, and sparked some thoughts. And then I kind of let that slide a little bit, and then one point a couple of years ago, I went down, as is my habit, to our school's office to just have a casual conversation about sports with my boss. And he happened to be on the phone with a publisher from Stenhouse. And they were talking about a conversation, of a book about conversations about race. And he literally poked his head out of the office and was like, "Do you want to write a book?" And I said, "Yes." And then I was like, oh, I need more details, like on what? And then he referenced the conversation. He said, "I think you had a pretty well received." I said, "Yeah, I did." And I just, I kicked the idea around, and it ended up, as I guess everyone who's written a book would tell you, it ended up being incredibly difficult. Yeah. But at the early part, I'm a writer, so I figured, I'll write a book and it'll be good. And it ended up being a lot of work. But I just was, as it has been in my life, I've just been blessed. I've just been incredibly fortunate that happened.
So I want to dive right in, right? You mentioned earlier at the professional development session that Frederick Douglass is one of your heroes, and he's one of mine as well, right? And in fact, the title of your book comes from his 1852 discussion. And so, do you think if we can imagine being back at the time, if Frederick Douglass was pressed, do you think he'd say that we need both light and fire rather than light instead of fire? And what I mean by that is you mentioned that you're ready to have the next conversation about race that goes beyond the superficial. But do you think that there are a number of people who haven't even had that first step of conversation, and that some light is needed in order to get them to join the conversation? I
think this is actually very important, and I have been very, very clear, or I've been trying to be, about the place of my book in the greater discourse. Yes. And I think that book's been written multiple times. There's plenty of information out there. If you read White Fragility, White Rage, why are all the black kids sitting together? There's a canon of books that discuss the importance of discussing race. And at some point, we have to decide that we're going to engage people who are ready for the next step. We're always talking, and what happens are people who have just people have decided to often give all of the energy to the newcomers to the conversation. Or or even worse, the willfully ignorant. And we spend so much time trying to engage the willfully ignorant that the teacher who's just really trying and just is making tactical errors gets left behind constantly. They'll read plenty of books, go to plenty of seminars, and it's always like, engage your privilege, engage this. And they're like, yes, what's next? And so what I tried to do, respecting, and really tried to do, is stay in my lane and try to engage the what's next conversation. Absolutely, everyone might. If you are living in this world and you are not accepting that race is important, that should be discussed, no, you're not ready for my book. Also, you probably shouldn't be teaching kids, to be honest. But if you are, you're already there. So you have to do some catching up. But I just think that we always spend so much energy on the willfully ignorant at the expense of, because we have limited stores of energy, and that comes at the expense of people who are trying and just don't know how. And that's where I think we need to spend more energy. And so I just tried to make my little contribution to that particular conversation.
I agree, and I'm glad you did that. And so here's another reason why I see your book as theorizing as well. You talk about ecosystems. You talk about how teachers can't just start these conversations, right? My sort of paraphrasing of what you're saying there is that if you're a teacher and you want to have meaningful discussions about race, you have to first set a context within which those kinds of conversations can happen. Otherwise, you're sort of wasting your time, or you get lucky or not. Would you think is that accurate?
Mostly.
Okay, go on.
Mostly. I don't want to. We already spend enough time at each other's throats in this business, and I'm not saying that you're wasting your time. But what I am saying is that you may be falling short of your potential, right? And that's why the distinction between light and fire was important to me, is that if you are not building an ecosystem where the kids are reliably listening to each other, valuing each other, respect you enough to have house talk with you, et cetera, and among other things, if your curriculum is not thematic, so that it's not just like race month or race week or race this, and that's it, and that's it, then what happens is you'll have successes. But we're looking for a place of reliable successes that are systemic and that actually change things. In order to do that, you need to build an ecosystem. So I'm not trashing any enough people trash teachers. I just want to take the bar about race conversations and push it past what these professionals say the limit is.
What is a dialogic teacher, and how common is dialogic teaching?
Just definition-wise, as how I'm using it, it's someone who uses throughout their pedagogy conversation as a tool, and as a very important tool, not a side thing that you do sometimes, but there is discussion everywhere at all times, and that's how most of the teaching and learning happens. With exceptions, you still teach writing skills or teach history or teach math, but conversations are the bedrock. As for your second question, I'm sure researchers have tackled that. I wouldn't even begin. I teach 9th and 10th graders English at SLA. That's
No, I don't think,
what I know.
As a researcher, I don't think researchers have a handle on that as well.
Oh, okay.
I would say most of what we see is sort of traditional didactic teaching to some set of standards, although that varies from school to school and from classroom to classroom.
Well, I find that frustrating.
Yeah, me too.
So I wonder sometimes, if you're not having conversation, for example, if you're in a humanities class, right? You're reading a book or you're studying a history. If you're not talking about it, if we're not training kids, like in the adult world, what they're going to be doing with the histories and the books that they're reading is talking about them. And so if we're not talking about it, what exactly are we doing? Like literally, I mean, what are we doing with them if we're not teaching them how to converse with each other? Because that's what the adult world's going to be doing, right? Like in the real world, they're not going to be taking tests on what happened on page 32.
So and on that score, let me ask a question more generally then. How do you see teachers of mathematics, science, where do they join the conversations about race? Or should they be expected to talk about issues that affect kids' identity in the classroom?
It's a fantastic question. Well, first I'll say I try to say purposely throughout the text that my experiences and
You do that.
and I try to stay,
But now you wrote a book, so you can pontificate.
What's important about that, though, honestly, is just teacher to teacher, and we all know people are always speaking to us about things that they don't understand. Like you'll have people who haven't taught a kid in 20 years be very specific about like something that we're doing wrong in the classroom, and it's a tough, it's always a tough. So I try to make sure, like I am in English, I teach kids English. That said, however, I think that it's important to contextualize the things you're teaching. So because I'm not a math teacher, I can't fully go, but what I can say is if you're learning the sciences, there are 1,000 ways that you can contextualize those sciences in ways that speak to the kids' lives. And I say in the book often that race is not some other lens that you use, but it's a lens that should be used constantly throughout the entire year.
Now, you had the help of your school in doing a lot of what happened in your classroom, right? You talk about in respect to ecosystems, you talk about the need to have, sort of threads and essential questions that run, sort of not only through your own class, but throughout the school. I mean, when you write about, for example, the pop-up conversations, and particularly, I'm thinking about the piece on 2016, what is it, November 8th, right? You weren't the only teacher that kind of, math teachers and science teachers and folks, how did your colleagues, you have the conversations about how you wrote about how your class went, how did their classes go on those days?
I mean, I tell you what, we know what that day was like. A lot of our kids were, to be frank, grieving. Mm-hmm. It was a grieving day. And it's one of those things where you come to school and you are really torn as to whether or not, what's the best thing to do for the kids today? Do they want to, I'm teaching the Odyssey. Should we just dive into the Odyssey and pretend that, Donald Trump wasn't just elected the president? Or should we throw the Odyssey away and mm-hmm. discuss this? And those are those conversations. And I was helped by my colleagues because they hung this sign. I'm paraphrasing. It's in the book you read. Yeah, yeah. But when the kids first walked into the school building, they put up this sign that essentially just said, "We love you. We value you. We're going to help. We're all going to get through this together." Mm-hmm. It was a very nice thing to walk into the room feeling like everybody is on the same page about this stuff. While I don't know, obviously, what happened in everyone's classroom, I am so blessed to be in a place, and I want every kid in this city and across the country to be in a place where they understand that every adult in that building's starting place is care. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that care is the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And I hate that I'm finding out that that's rare sometimes throughout this mm-hmm. country. I hate that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I actually hate that. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm being brought in to help schools with things that are just love the kids. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, thank you for bringing me in, My daughter has to pay for my daughter's college, so thank you for bringing me in. But love your students. Yeah. Put their well-being first. Yeah. It's frustrating.
I like the way you write about how sort of race issues are human issues, and they're connected to all of that. And that those relationships that we establish with kids early on sort of helped to enable that as well. But the reason why I asked my question about your school, it seems like you're helped in some degree, right? And you talk about, for example, sort of the threads that run through all of the classes and all of the curriculum, where in ninth grade, you have, I think identity is the focus, right? And you have questions about who am I and who are my people and those kinds of things. And you move on from there to systems and what have you. And so even science teachers would be able to connect the 2016 election to systems change, right? And so it gives, and I think also one of the strengths of your book as well is that you, as you say, stay in your lane, right? You 100% of what is written in here, Matthew knows and has seen and has heard. But because you've done this, you have license to sort of think about what ought to be, right? And so how do you think this would have been made harder or easier if you were not among like-minded colleagues? And maybe that's a loaded question.
Nope. No, that's not. I get versions of that. Okay, so like-minded on a few different things. It's different. In some places, like-minded means they have a different approach to pedagogy, which seems to be what you're leading towards. And that's a very rich conversation that involves looking at research and figuring out what does this school believe in, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that. And but then specific to race, though, I get often, what is it like to work with, what advice do I give if you're the only one?
That's what I'm getting at.
If you're the only one in your building that wants to engage race. And it's tough because with the stay in your lane piece, I never want to overextend myself and put myself in their shoes in the way. Like, I've been blessed to be in a place where I'm not the only one, and there are many places where I'm not the only one, but and to that I say, and often that question comes tinged with, how do I convince them to talk race? And to that I say, in the end of the book, some version of, we've got to help each other out and build community outside of our school buildings. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where we've got to create a network of teachers who are, as the kids say, about this life. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to talk race. And if I can't figure out how to do it if I can't build with my colleague next door, I got to find a colleague in the next school. Mm-hmm. I got to find I got to come to events like this and exchange phone numbers and exchange Twitter handles, and I've got to make sure I build my network, because, to be frank, the kids are first, and being isolated in this does not excuse us for having it. If you know it's right, then you got to have it. And so this practical advice I give at the end is to build is network building. And while it's way more complicated than that, I think it's very important that, at all the professional developments I do, I try to create. If you were across the way, there was conversation. It was just about as much of them talking to each other as there was me talking to them. And hopefully a friend is made. And hopefully you realize I'm not alone in this and you can talk to somebody else.
But that support has allowed you to do things that I think some teachers are not able to do. Like, what I'm thinking, for example, is the part 2 of the book is when you give sort of 4 examples of discussions you've had. And some of them, quite frankly, are pretty bold, pedagogical moves. Do you want to?
Well, no,
should I set up?
You can go.
I'm thinking, and can I say it? Well, you wrote it. It's published, so I can say it out loud. Right?
The N-word one.
And I'm thinking of doing things like taking on the N-word directly, right? By, as a teacher, sort of writing the word.
Yeah, it was.
And not N-word on the board, the actual word on the board.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Where I start off is saying, first, pretty much my worst nightmare involving this book is someone, and I know it because people take the table of contents and they flip, and they get to chapter 5, and they go, ooh. Pretty much my worst nightmare is anyone doing that. You take the book, you open up, you go to chapter 5, and you say, I'll start here. It's pretty much my worst nightmare, because as you can see from read the book, there's each and every one of those chapters in the last half, basically the last half, for those who haven't seen it, they're all I kind of have fun with my narrative and storytelling. They're all case studies from my room, and it's 4 example conversations. One is the N-word, one is conversations about students' names, one is the Trump election, that's the last one, and one is appropriation. And so each of them are, and what they are, they're mashups, they're composites. So Imani was one of my students, so they're mashups, so they're like quotes that I remember from different years, and I put kids in conversation with each other, even though like I had one in 2016 and one in 2010, but I build a model classroom from real student exchanges. And I put basically the most interesting and telling, and many of my mistakes. I put in stuff I've done wrong and say why I did it wrong. So they are probably the most interesting chapters to read, because they're stories. But I think I even addressed that at the end of the N-word chapter, because essentially what happens is we're reading Kindred, Octavia Butler's Kindred, we were, and a few other books that had the N-word in it. And I was, we do read alouds and stuff like that, and it always made for strangeness when we got to those conversations. And I wanted to, as an English teacher, engage the word itself and unpack our relationships with it. And so that's what that conversation describes. I don't want to spoil too, but that's what it describes. But in the chapter, I mentioned the year, and I think it was the first year where my boss walked in.
Yeah, you did.
Right? So I'm sitting there, and the kids are having this awesome conversation, right?
And the word is on the board.
Word's still on the board. I haven't erased it yet. And my principal, this white guy, walks in, and I freeze, because I'm like, I'm about to lose my job. I've gone too far. I'm like the teachers in the video that I showed you. I told you I'm a line stepper. And because we had an excellent conversation. It was one of those. It was an excellent conversation. But I actually used that moment as a little note, and I have notes to administrators throughout the whole piece, as a note to administrators on how we handled that, of how he handled that situation in a way that encouraged me, supported me, checked me, but also all of and how administrators and teachers, the relationship that we should have around race conversations. So without spoiling too much, I think support systems are important. Yeah. And I've been in places, I've been in places, I've taught in places where an admin walks in and the first thing they're looking for is this written on the board, and there's like a checklist, right? And everything I'm getting comments on is about this checklist or about this thing. And there are many things in this book, from the Burn 5 to things, which means I would epically fail that test every single time. You walk in my classroom at my old school, admin will walk in, I'm doing my Burn 5, I'm building relationships with the kids, and he'd pull me aside and say, where's the thing on the board? Where's the... What?
Well, and I raise this point because as I read it as someone, again, who's at a university and someone who trains teachers and administrators, I kind of read it with the lens of not only lessons for teachers, but also lessons for administrators. I think it could have went down differently if you had a different principal come into class. You also write about how these conversations don't come without risks. Right, you're in a classroom that is diverse. You have, white kids, black kids, Latino kids, and so you can imagine how, in a different context, that the result might have been different. Which sort of underscores your point of not only teachers. This is not only the identity work of teachers, but it's the identity work of it's the work of administrators and folks who want to do better by kids.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be a principal eventually, right? And it makes me think, what are the conditions that you have to make so that your teachers feel brave enough to take smart risks? I think that chapter is a good example of what to do when you have, some 21-year-old some teacher who, watches too much Dangerous Minds and Freedom Riders and is trying to go out there, and how do you not kill that spirit of that teacher while still encouraging them to grow. And it's something I hope I'm going to end up good at, because I've seen it, I've benefited from it.
And I guess what I like most is how you let the kids do the work, right? They brought their own positionalities and their own identities to those discussions. And even other words, you did it, similar thing with ghetto, right? And what does it mean, and to unpack it. And you talk about allowing kids to not talk if they don't want, to opt out because of the risk as well. I want to shift gears a little bit. In the other room, you ran out of time, but you showed a big clip of the Jeffersonian dismissals, right?
That's my part.
Which I enjoyed too. Why don't you say what that is, and what were you going to say?
All right, so it really did. I don't have the quote. Oh, wait.
You can.
No, it's not. I'm going to bore you with that. Essentially, Thomas Jefferson was one of the best known race theorists of his day. We don't tend to know that. And the reason we don't tend to know that is what he wrote. Like, we remember him from other things, for like writing the Declaration. Like, we know him from other things, but we've completely erased the idea that he was a race theorist. Like, he wrote many works on the nature of race. The reason is, if you read it, it's Nazi. It is about as clearly Nazi as you can possibly, like, if you were to erase, if you changed, modern up the language a little bit, it's terrible. But one of the things he says, and he's actually addressing Phyllis Wheatley. He's talking about Phyllis Wheatley, the poet, black poet, enslaved, one of the first models that our brains work for white people in this country. And he's speaking about Phyllis Wheatley, and about, other magical slaves whose brains work. And he starts speaking about how we don't make good poetry. He says, with most races, and he directly addresses, like, I think Indians, I think Native Americans, he directly addresses them. He says, at least when they go through stuff, they struggle a lot, but when they go through stuff, at least they make, good art. Among the blacks is misery enough, but no poetry. That's his quote. Thomas Jefferson. And so what that made me think of was how often we unintentionally continue his legacy when we speak about race. For example, how many times when we're discussing race is the only context we ever use oppression? How often do we make every conversation about race about overcoming white people? We just insert white people into every single conversation about brown people. And we think about the curriculum of February. We think about,
February soup.
I call it February soup.
My next question.
Oh, was that your next question?
No, but go on. This is great. This is great.
I call it February soup. And it is essentially this idea where kids get to the point where they learn that to discuss race is just to discuss oppression. I'm not saying don't discuss oppression. We need to discuss overcoming oppression. That needs to take a central role in our conversations. But how often is it, whenever we're talking about black, we're talking about overcoming whiteness? It's always the same thing. How often? And the story I tell was when I first started teaching African American Lit to seniors. And I got excited the way teachers do. I got a whole curriculum. I'm changing lives and all this stuff. And I get there, and a kid comes up to me, and they're like, man, I'm so excited I got you for this class. I say, yeah, I'm excited to teach it. He says, well, you know what? I'm excited because I know you. You're not just going to make this whole class about white people overcoming. It's not just going to be a slavery class, Jim Crow class. It's not just going to be. It's not going to be. It's not all it's going to be. It's going to be. We're going to talk about. And I'm listening to this kid talk, and in my brain, I have an entire semester planned of overcoming white people stories. It's the entire The entire semester, I started in Africa, slavery. I worked my way up. I was talking about slave revolts. I was going the entire, and I'm sitting there, yeah, you know I got you, bro. I ain't gonna, I went home and I was like, I gotta teach about jazz and hip hop now. I gotta talk about black cuisine and fashion. I have to have them read stories with black people as central characters without white people in them. Or without white people as central roles, or without overcoming white people as the main conflict. And I'm saying, I have not prepared for this, and class starts tomorrow. It was really rough. Had to tread water for a while. But it made me think about this idea of me unintentionally continuing a very ugly legacy that Thomas Jefferson said. It says, all they are is misery. That's all they are. And Du Bois talks about that when he says in the opening of Souls of Black Folk, how everyone always wants to ask me the same question, and they always frame it differently, but it's always the same question. And the question is, how does it feel to be a problem? That's how he opens the essay. How does it feel to be a problem? And I'm thinking, how many times are our brown children confronted with, how does it feel to be a problem? And that's the only thing that race conversation is. And the white children, how does it feel to be a problem? I was having an interesting conversation with a colleague, and we were talking about, part of the nature of privilege is our brown children, when they leave school, they'll always have to talk about race. It's part of their lives, right? And part of the nature of privilege is that many of our white children, they'll start to leave the places where people are going to make them talk about race, right? They'll start to graduate from, you're not in Mr. K's class anymore. You're not in high school anymore. You're not this. No, you don't really have to engage it if you don't want to. That frightens me. Frightens me. So what are we doing in our classrooms to make it so that race conversations are something that white folks are going to opt into occasionally? And that black folks and Latino folks and Asian folks are going to opt into thoughtfully.
You wrote that you want kids to, the teachers ought to push kids to grapple with hard problems and to encourage new lines of inquiry around race. What did you mean by that?
Well, adults are having conversations about race all the time as it comes to how it impacts our lives, right? And sometimes, yet, we recycle the same conversations for our young people, right? For example, right? We'll have a conversation with young people, and, it'll be Booker T. Washington versus W.B. Du Bois, some sort of debate, something, right? And it'll be a recycled debate, right? And we'll pretend like those issues aren't happening now, and there's not a modern version of that debate for them to be having, that the adults in the real world are having at the same time. And the example I use in the book is about I think the hard problem example maybe that I use in the book is kids engaging. They were coming to me a few years ago when funding was really bad for schools, and and they're bringing in toilet paper as school supplies, and things are really rough, and they're coming to me what should we, why is it like this? It's one of those pop-up comments, why is it like this? And I could have a surface conversation about that. But then you have this conversation, well, how come some schools, do you think every school in the country has to bring in toilet paper as a school supply? Do you think reams of paper are normal school supplies for children to be bringing in? And we start having those conversations. And then what pushed it to a hard conversation, we started thinking about, what would a suburban white person need to hear to support a fair funding formula? Literally, what do they need to hear? And I have an example in the book about role-playing. We role-played that. We're the kids say, well, because it's fair. I'm well, my kids go to Lower Merion, so I'm cool. Well, my kids go to Cheltenham. I'm cool. Why do I have to pay more money for your kids? You're not my kids. Matter of fact, if you look at it the right way, you're competition for my kids. Why would I pay more money for Philadelphia? It don't make no sense. We started having some of these conversations, and the kids were having that good frustration where they're trying to figure out how do we, and I said, you know what? This is what the state assembly is grappling with right now. They're having the real conversation, not the recycled one from the curriculum. Does that make sense?
It does, and there were some other examples as well where I think you might have bothered some of your students a little much, right? When you had the lesson on minstrel, right? When you
Minstrel shows, yeah.
minstrel shows, the 20th century minstrel shows, and I think you asked them to look for linkages to current day hip hop, and you actually displayed lyrics for them and asked them to sort of make sense of that. What prompted you to do that, and how did it go?
Well, I mean, so and that's another the model conversation. That's the one about that's like a widely ranging conversation.
Yeah.
I teach native son
That's right.
to 10th graders, and at one point in the book, the boys, Bigger Thomas and his buddy, are on the south side of Chicago, just on the street, just lounging around, and they're lounging, and they decide to play white, right? And I kind of, the first couple of years I taught it, I just kind of moved past that part. I just read it. And then one day I was preparing. I said, oh, wait, whoa, minstrel, whoa. It turned huge. Because in the thing, they like put on white voices, like, hello, stuff like that. And they play it. And so I asked the kids just on a lark one day, I said, how many of you have done this? And they freaked out. Like all of them put their hands up. Like, I've played white. I've played white. And we had a conversation about what does it mean? Like, why? What is this urge to play white? And he said, well, it's funny. It's like making fun of Starbucks girls and stuff like that. Like having a conversation. And it turned into a real conversation. Then the obvious flip is, what is the urge to play black? Which is relevant now.
Yeah, it is.
Why do you keep putting on blackface? But literally why? Not just like what psychologically leads people to put on blackface. That's what I tried to tackle in that chat. Like, why would you? What urges drive you to do that? Why would you get in that picture? You know what I mean? Like the governor, why would you do that? Like, what would get you in that picture? Why is that even funny to you? Why is it even entertaining to you? What is that? Is it connected to your wanting to play white? Which is a troubling connection, right? But we just unpacked it and we see what went. The good and bad parts are in the chapter.
So you also talk about how before teachers engage in these race conversations, that we have to own our own personal catalysts, right? And you list some of the things that we should know about why we want to do it. Why don't you discuss what that is and why it's important to know your positionality, and then I have a follow-up question after that.
Well, okay, so briefly, it's just why are you having it?
Yeah.
Outside of the curriculum. Like, for example, sometimes you have a race conversation because you want to be cool. You have a race conversation because there's an elephant in the room. You have a race conversation because, you want the kids to like you. You have a race conversation because you're feeling guilty. You found out about a new privilege and you want to, unpack that with the kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just think it's important for us to engage why we're doing something on a personal level. Because, something I always say is we're blessed as teachers because there's a lot of jobs, right, where something happens in the world and then you literally don't know where to put it. Does that make sense?
It does.
Like if you get upset, your job does not offer you the opportunity to feel like you're part of a solution. You're just kind of going back to your cubicle, you're going back to your job, you're going back to this thing, and it's good, and you're supporting your family and stuff like that. But teachers are fortunate because we never have to feel completely useless. You know what I mean? Like if we hear about something, we have a sphere of influence. We know that there's 30-something kids that we can thoughtfully engage on this topic, and that's a blessing. Like it really is. And sometimes we lose sight of that privilege that we have in our lives that a lot of people don't have in their lives. And the problem is sometimes that's not kid-centered, that's about us. Like you know what I mean? Like we're upset, so we're like, did you know what happened? And that's not a good enough impetus to have conversation with the kids. And so you need to be aware of why you're having it because it might be all about you, not about the kids.
And that was my takeaway as well. Is it about sort of assuaging guilt or venting, or is it really about, sort of doing the identity work for kids, like helping them to figure out where they stand on this issue, as well?
I have teachers ask me, Well, essentially what I'll say when folks ask me that question is, the kids are not our racial therapists. That's not their job. They're not there to help us work through something, help us unpack something. Like, we're their teacher. Like, we need to talk to our friends if we need to unpack something. It's not them, right? But sometimes we bring our stuff into the classroom, and I don't think that's fair.
And also, as a researcher, there is sort of evidence that kids who have higher racialized identity are also stronger students as well. So it gets, again, back to the point that you're making, which is, building relationships and doing identity work is not something else. It's actually part of pedagogy as well, and what teachers ought to be doing. I liked the way the book is organized, and I did not read chapter 5 first, although I was tempted to do it because you do the groundwork and discuss what has to happen before that can happen. And you just mentioned like the 4 other chapters, not only the N-word, but cultural significance of names and cultural appropriation and pop-up conversations. You probably had other conversations that were left out, right? If you were going to add like another chapter, what would you think that you'd add to that?
Oh, I had like 4. I had like 4 more.
What are a couple?
I had like 4 more. Well, a couple of them I just didn't put in because they weren't good, which was hard. And I had to like go back and talk to kids, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I thought I did this to you. Like literally, there were some conversations that I thought I was good, and then applying the standard to the first half of the book, I had to be humble and reflect, like I said over there, and say, this is not something I want. I can't stand behind this. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done this. Like, for example, there's one in there in my, the draft you sent to the publisher. I had one. There was a role play about gentrification, and in retrospect, it doesn't hold up. Like, I shouldn't have done that. That was bad, right? And I was like, that was really bad. And it was something I hadn't done for years. Like, it was something I hadn't done since like 2008 or whatever.
But you do a good job of letting people know the mistakes that you've made.
I try,
as well as the successes.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, if I don't, then I'll model the idea that it's going to be perfect.
That's right.
And it's not going to be perfect. And each one of those conversations has progressively gotten better over the years with a couple, it'll fall back one year and then I'll fix it. But I can't ask teachers to be humble if I'm not going to put in print the mistakes I've made. Like I tried to do it purposely in print. I even tried to measure it. I can't put another success in there. I got to put something that went wrong.
As a reader, if I had to pick one for you, it would be fun to see a conversation of your kids talking about institutionalized racism versus individual prejudice, right? In college, we have these kinds of conversations, and it's interesting to see how kids come down on that. I got the 5-minute mark, so just a couple more questions. So, of course, you're a secondary high school teacher, right? And but there are some stories, like you talk about Zen, and everyone likes to beat up on Christopher Columbus, and apart from that, what are some other implications you think this may have? What if I'm an elementary or middle school teacher and I want to take something away? What do you think the takeaways for folks who teach younger kids might be?
I get that a lot. I actually don't think that there's too many differences, to be honest. Like, some things are not grade appropriate because the kids won't understand it. Like, they read it, they won't understand what it is. So it's not grade appropriate. But I get, I'm not saying this is what you're asking, but I get versions of that question. I go out to the suburbs and they'll say like, just a podcast, just ask me this. When do you think it's appropriate for us to be discussing race with young children? Like, and a white guy asked me this, when do you think it's appropriate? And I'm going like, what? When is it appropriate? Always. And I'm thinking, ask yourself, when do brown people start speaking about race with their children? That's when you should start speaking about race with your children. Like, I had to learn where to hold my hands when the police pull me over when I was like absurdly too young to drive. Like, we're talking race all of the time. And the guy was like taken aback a little bit. He says, well, like really young, like second graders? I'm like, yes. Like, why not? But I think that's a big problem, and that's part of the Jefferson thing, where it's like, well, my kid's in this idyllic phase where life is just great, and we don't need to talk about that hard stuff until. And I'm like, the brown people in your life have been having these conversations with their children from the beginning. The second their kid comes home and says, why is my hair different? The second my kid, like, we've been having these conversations. I say early, elementary school teachers, you can have, well, not the N-word, but like, many of the conversations are in this book. There are junior versions of. I'm not here for any excuses about kids are too young. I'm sorry, because that tends to cut along racial lines. Like, kids are too young. Brown kids are never too young for anything. We're always too old. Like, literally, we're always too old. When you think about, but we're, like, our girls are too old. You know, they should have known better. They're old. Our boys are too old. They're too, like, we expect them to be grown-ups when they're like 5. You know, our white children get this extended, like, Donald Trump Jr. childhood that lasts into, like, their 50s. It doesn't make any sense. Like, I'm sorry, that like personally gets under my skin about how we have to just maintain the innocence of young, privileged white kids.
I appreciate that response because I get asked that question as well as a college professor, but I kind of answer that question as a parent. I have 2 kids that are teenagers now. As soon as they could say it, I can respond to them and treat them like knowledgeable people. And so as early as the ideas are implanted, that's how early they could talk it. We're just about out of time. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to see if there's anything that we didn't talk about that you just want to leave us with, and then we'll turn it over before we.
You can do it. I think I'll go with that. I think I open up the book with this idea that there's this magical teacher, and Hollywood and our undergrad programs and everyone just builds up this idea of this charismatic, young, iconoclastic teacher who can just go in there. And it's so alienating. Like, yes, you also can lead conversations, 42-year-old white woman teacher. Yes, you can also hold conversations, 55-year-old black man teacher. Yes, you can have conversations, 23-year-old college grad Latino. Everyone can. Matter of fact, we cannot take good people off the field. There are enough bad people in the world that every single person, that's why I wanted to write a how book, every single person who has a right mind and who has been blessed with this idea that we need to change things can do it. I don't want you, like, we shouldn't be jealous of that person down the hall who's able to do it well. We shouldn't be jealous, like, everyone can. And you should be hard on anyone who ever tells you that you have to be young, that you have to be, you know, that if you're white, you can't do it. That if you're a woman, you can't reach young black men. That's happening now. Only black men can talk to black men. Like, everyone can do it if you're willing to put in the work. And so that's what I would leave. It's like, there's no magic. Just work hard.
Thanks. So let's try.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jordan. Thank you, Matthew. There are a couple of questions that have come in, so this is sort of, it's like the speed round on Jeopardy. So it won't be a conversation. I won't come back with a double question, but there are some questions. And I want to thank God for all of you that have come out tonight to be a part of this conversation. Matthew, I want to thank you for reminding us that 55-year-old black men still can do something. Amen. Appreciate that. How do popular charter pedagogies and models like Teach Like a Champion fit into this conversation? Should they and do they?
I'm not an expert on, this is part of staying in your lane. I am not an expert. I have been in the same school I've been at for a very long time. I was started in a charter school, but it's been a long time. So I actually don't feel particularly qualified to answer that question.
Thank you. All right. So in fact, this leads to the next one. Where do you teach? And are you still teaching English, and where are you teaching?
Science Leadership Academy. I teach 9th and 10th graders English.
All right, thank you. As we discuss these race conversations, how does any of this address the lack of diversity in the staffing of our schools? What can be done to address that issue?
I really wish that that issue was addressed with the level of complexity that it needs. That's one of those things that's really a hard problem, like I mentioned in the book, and it does not have any one. We keep coming up with different single solutions to that. I just know that I was token in just about every education class I took at Westchester. Like just about every one. And black male, I am consistently, for half my class, the first black male teacher that they've had in ninth grade or 10th grade. But I think it's systemic. I think something about school makes it so young black boys don't even want to grow up to be teachers. It's not even, sometimes we focus on the back end, like how can we better support them? The problem's deeper than that. Like, I wasn't in school with black men who wanted to be teachers. So I wish I had, sure, we got to just get a bunch of smart people in a room and kick around ideas till we get to something. Yeah. But it's a deeper problem than just how to best support us once we're already in the profession.
So thank you for that. We understand how it makes sense that you're doing this because you're an English teacher and you engage poetry and you engage language, and therefore you're going to have this conversation. But this person says, I'm a 7th grade math teacher, and I teach 7th grade human beings. Do I have a responsibility to engage this? I'm dealing with numbers. And so does this fall on me to take up this discussion?
Yes. 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 Look, if you can, at a certain point, sometimes I am teaching about run-on sentences, and that is the lesson. Sometimes we are talking about paragraphing or figurative language or what a motif is. That's what we were talking about today. We're reading the book Thief, and what are the motifs in this book? That's all we're doing. We're not doing, but if you can't find one space or any consistent space throughout to engage this topic, I guess, but we're falling short of your potential.
So what tips for dealing with race talk fatigue do you have for students who may leave conversations feeling like white peers still just don't get it? I don't feel heard. And what tips for teachers whose peers also tire them out?
Well, that piece about I don't feel heard, I think continuing the conversation, I would welcome them to read the chapter about conversations in just the ecosystem, because there's that part of it, right? I don't feel heard is something that we need to address from everyone. I don't feel heard because it's a massive thing. As far as, white kids don't get it, yes, sometimes they won't. And we just need to continue to build past this Jeffersonian point where we're presenting brown people, black people, Latino people, Asian people, we're presenting brown people in full enough contexts where they have no choice but to understand us. We flatten our experiences so often that white people just think we're easy to understand because we think, it's oppression. You're sad, you're angry, I get it. White people were mean to you, right? We flatten our own experiences so much that we sometimes don't, we make it easier for them to dismiss us. Just tolerate us long enough in February, and then we won't have to engage race conversations anymore.
How do we have this conversation about race within the African diaspora? How do you have this? I teach in a school where there aren't very few white kids, and yet the conversation of the good and bad hair, dark or you're fair. What are some tips around that conversation?
There are so many. I think probably the most important thing is this push to the hard problem, especially encouraging students. The thing I said about white kids they can choose to opt out forever. if they want to. Most of them can choose to opt in, never, which still freaks me out. Like, that's incredible. Like, they'll be able to just not engage minorities. But as far as us, I think the biggest thought is, how do we model engaging race ideas with our whole brain? Like the CNN clip I showed in the other room. What happens is we're tricked into sometimes only engaging our emotions when talking about race issues, and just forgetting that we're blessed with discernment and brains. And because everyone takes advantage of our emotions and sends us on wild goose chases. And I think the biggest thing in dealing with minority kids in a mostly minority environment is that's an opportunity, because there's no white people there. So you don't have to deal with that particular layer. You get to say, all right, let's really get to hard problems, because we don't have to deal with anyone's white guilt. We don't have to deal with anyone's, that racism thing or that white guilt thing, that complicating factor is not in the situation anymore. But let's address this N-word. What's it mean? How do we do it? Let's address appropriation. Why does it make us feel this way? How can we, let's address among our own community in a thoughtful way, not just an emotional way.
His name is Matthew Kay. He's 30 years old. He's an English teacher here in Philadelphia Public School System. He's presented his work to us tonight. Won't you help me appropriately appreciate him? Amen. Listen, Matthew Kay's book, Not Light But Fire, will be given to the school district of Philadelphia teachers who signed for tonight's professional development. They'll be given to the assistant superintendents, who will give them to the school principal at the March network meeting, and will be delivered to the teachers. I want to thank Evelyn Sample Oates for facilitating this. The Chief Academic Officer for Philadelphia is here tonight. I want to thank all of you for being here. Teachers from the city school are here. Persons from Springside are here. Members of the Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church, I want to thank you for coming out tonight and being a part of this conversation. We continue to work for our children. We continue. There are a lot of things we thought about tonight. We didn't, as you were coming in and encountering our praise, and we didn't want anyone to think that this was a bait and switch. We invite you to a conversation about education, then we're going to get you saved. And so we didn't want to cross over any lines, and we want you to know that whoever you are, however you have come, from whatever tradition you come, you're welcome here at Enon. We want you to know how blessed we were that you came to experience a conversation. This is not the only time of the year that we have this conversation, but Matthew, I am so grateful for you, so proud of you, boy, and appreciate you. Dr. Will, thank you for coming and helping to ask the questions that I can't go deep enough on. And I'm sure that Matthew's father and grandmothers are sitting in here and so excited to be here, Mr. Rosamond Kay. So listen, I'm going to ask us to stand. I am going to pray for y'all before you get out of here, because I get in trouble with my boss if I let anybody leave his house and I didn't make sure they'll be safe. But listen, we're grateful. I hope that you'll take very seriously the work that we do with our children. Those of you that are teachers that know me, you know I'm tempted to tell my story. So I just won't do it. I won't do it. I'll wait for second weekend. But I'm going to ask you to hold the hand of the person that's next to you. I'm going to ask you to hold the hand of the person that is next to you. God, I thank you for friends. I thank you for gifts that you've given. Thank you for Matthew, and I thank you for Dr. Will. I thank you, God, for every teacher in here. I thank you for the teacher that is stretching tonight. I thank you for the teacher that is struggling tonight. I thank you for the teacher that is in a well-funded school. I thank you for the teacher that is in a school that is struggling. I thank you for their resolve. I thank you for you use them to turn on the light. Lord, I ask now that as we have received this moment, that you would hide it in our hearts. And I pray, oh God, that you would open up opportunities for the learning of this moment to translate into the lives of children. Now, dismiss us from this place, but never from your saving grace. Lord, we ask you to give us traveling grace until we meet again. It is through Christ, and for his sake we do pray. Let us all say, amen. Amen. Won't you come down, if you don't mind, and just greet Matthew and thank him for this gift that he's given us. Yep. Thank you so much for being here, man. All right.